So welcome everyone to today's talk. The title is The Ancient Foods with Modern Benefits, an overview of the health effects of soy foods. It is the 13th talk of a series targeting to promote agrobiotechnology and enhance understanding of the potential applications of agricultural products. We hope the series will inspire international scholars, researchers, farmers, and business in the agricultural field, as well as interested public. So let me introduce our speaker, Dr. Mark Messina, who is the Director of Nutrition Science and Research for the Soy Nutrition Institute Global, the co-owner of Nutrition Matters, a nutrition consulting company, and an adjunct associate professor at Loma University. Dr. Messina has devoted his time to the study of the health effects of soy foods and soybean components, such as isoflavones. He writes extensively on these subjects, having published more than 100 articles and book chapters for health professionals, and has given more than 700 presentations to both customer and professional groups in 55 countries. So you're very lucky today. Furthermore, Dr. Messina is the chairperson of the editorial advisory board of and writes a regular column for the Soy Connection, a quarterly newsletter that reaches over 250,000 dietitians and other health professionals. In the following presentation, he's going to give an overview of the health effects of soy foods, as well as their controversies, with the support of the scientific literature, clinical and observational studies. Now, please welcome Dr. Messina to the floor. Mark, your time.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. And can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, good evening, everyone. It's morning here, but I'm very happy to have this opportunity to share with you information about the health effects of soy foods, a topic that I have been researching for more than 30 years. For my presentation today, I am going to first talk about the quality of soy protein and its ability to promote gains in muscle mass and strength in response to resistance exercise. Then I'll talk about the ability of soy protein to lower blood cholesterol levels. Then I'll introduce the topic of isoflavones. Isoflavones are very interesting compounds in soybeans, and it's the reason I entered this field 3 decades ago. I'll talk about the role that isoflavones and soy may have in reducing breast cancer risk and in reducing wrinkles. And then finally, I'll address some of the myths or misunderstandings about soy, and then soy allergy. The first point I want to make is that soybeans are higher in protein than other legumes. Soybeans get about 42% of their calories from protein. Most beans get about 25% of their calories from protein. Consequently, one serving of a traditional soy food, such as tempeh or miso, can provide anywhere from about 7 grams of protein per serving for soy milk to as high as 20 grams of protein for a food such as tempeh. And then at the very bottom, we have a soy burger. This is one of the more popular burgers in the United States that provide 19 grams of protein per serving. Of course, it's important to not just consider the amount of protein provided by a food, but also the quality of that protein. And protein quality refers to the ability of a protein to meet the biological requirements for indispensable or essential amino acids. Much of what we know about the quality of soy protein is actually based on research involving the soy protein ingredients. These are concentrated sources of soy protein, ranging in protein content from about 50% for soy flour to as high as 90% for soy protein isolate. And these soy protein ingredients are widely used by the food industry for their functional attributes. So they can be added to foods in very small amounts. They're able to change the texture of a product, to increase shelf life, and to increase moisture retention. In addition to being used for their functional properties, these soy ingredients are also used as a base for making meat analogs or meat substitutes, and are used in the making of energy bars as a way to increase the protein content. Now, two factors determine the quality of a protein: digestibility and essential amino acid content. Of course, if you're unable to digest the protein into its constituent amino acids, you're unable to absorb those amino acids and therefore are not able to use them to synthesize the proteins our body requires. And we need different amounts of each of the essential amino acids. So the closer the pattern of essential amino acids is in a food to our body's requirement for those essential amino acids, the higher the quality of the protein. Now, of these two factors, essential amino acid content is a much bigger determinant of protein quality because most proteins are fairly well digested. The method used by many regulatory bodies around the world for determining protein quality, and that's the method used by the FAO, is the protein digestibility corrected amino acid score. This method simply takes into consideration the two factors I just discussed, that is digestibility and essential amino acid content. Here we have scores for a variety of different proteins. You can see that soy protein isolate receives a score of 1.0. That's the highest score using this methodology. That's the same score that egg white receives and milk receives. But you can see that soy protein isolate is a little bit higher in quality than beef and much higher in quality than the other plant proteins listed on this slide. Now, very recently, the FAO recommended gradually replacing the method I just discussed, the protein digestibility corrected amino acid score, with a new method called the digestible indispensable amino acid score. Now, it will likely be many years before this method is accepted by regulatory bodies, but because it is widely discussed in the literature, I did want to cover this topic with you. There are several important differences between the new method and the older method. For example, digestibility of the protein is determined at the end of the small intestine rather than the large intestine, and it's based on the digestibility of individual amino acids rather than the protein overall. And it's also possible to have scores above 100. Here we see some scores using this new method for some soy products and a product based on pea protein compared to lean ground beef. You can see that the scores for the soy foods are quite good, 107% for the soy burger, 97% for tofu, and 117% for soy milk. And those scores compare favorably to the score for lean ground beef, but they are much higher than the score for this burger that is made using pea protein. Pea protein is increasingly being used as a protein in the manufacture of plant-based products. Well, so we know that soy is a high quality protein, but how does it compare as a source of protein for building muscle in response to resistance exercise training? Well, if you go through the literature, you'll see that many experts consider whey protein to be the optimal source of protein for building muscle. Whey represents about 20% of the protein in milk, casein, the other 80%. Whey is thought to be a good protein for building muscle because it's high in the amino acid leucine, which is one trigger for muscle protein synthesis. However, several of us published a meta-analysis, a statistical analysis of clinical studies, published in 2018, that found soy protein supplementation leads to similar gains in muscle mass and strength in response to resistance exercise training as whey and animal protein supplementation. This meta-analysis included 9 studies that ranged in duration from 6 to 36 weeks. 5 studies compared soy with whey, and 4 studies compared soy with beef, dairy, or milk protein. Now, one thing that's very clear is that athletes, both endurance athletes and strength athletes, people engaged in resistance exercise training, such as weightlifting, and also runners, need more protein than sedentary individuals, more protein than the RDA. The RDA is 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight. And I think a good estimate of the amount of protein needed by individuals who are exercising is about 1.6 grams per kilogram body weight, so about twice the RDA. Now, one area where the quality of a protein, as well as the amount of protein consumed, may be very important is in preventing sarcopenia. Sarcopenia refers to age-related loss in muscle mass. And unfortunately, we lose about 3 to 8% of our muscle mass per decade after the age of 30. And we actually lose more strength than we do muscle mass. And it's important to keep muscle mass and strength, not only for metabolic reasons, but also for the overall quality of your life. Now, the FAO recommends that older people consume about 25% more protein than younger individuals in an attempt to prevent or delay sarcopenia. So I'd like to present the results of a very interesting study from China that was published earlier this year that found daily supplementation with high quality protein maintain lean muscle mass and physical performance in healthy older adults with low lean mass. So I will walk you through this study. So it involves 62 older Chinese men and women. It was a 6-month study using a parallel design. All of the individuals at study enrollment had low lean mass, muscle mass, and then they were randomized into one of 4 diets. One diet required that the individuals consumed an additional 16 grams of protein per day from soy protein. The other diet, 16 grams of additional protein from whey. The third diet was a mixture of soy and whey. And then the 4th diet was the control. These individuals continued to consume their habitual diet. Now, this is a busy table, so I just want to highlight one particular row. This row shows that at baseline, at the beginning of the study, the individuals were consuming considerably more protein than the RDA. Again, the RDA is 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight. Here we see these individuals were consuming about 1.1 grams per kilogram body weight, so about 30% more than the RDA. Nevertheless, those individuals who did not add additional protein to their diet experienced a loss in lean mass, muscle mass, and their performance worsened. So the speed at which they walked slowed over the 6-month period, and it took them longer to stand up from a chair. In contrast, the individuals who consumed either the whey protein, the soy protein, or the blend, the mixture of the two proteins, experienced gains in muscle mass and their performance improved. So consuming additional high quality protein such as soy may help to prevent sarcopenia. So soy is a high quality protein. It promotes gains in muscle mass. It's also able to lower blood cholesterol levels. Now, this is a research area that has been studied for 50 years. The first clinical study showing that soy protein lowers blood cholesterol was published in 1967. Of course, as you know, elevated cholesterol is a major risk factor for coronary heart disease. And I want to emphasize that I'm talking about a direct effect of the protein. Now, soybeans and soy foods are high in polyunsaturated fat, and that's a second mechanism by which soy foods can reduce blood cholesterol levels. But here I'm talking about the protein itself. In 1999, after conducting its own analysis of the literature, the Food and Drug Administration in the United States approved a health claim for soy foods and coronary heart disease. The claim reads 25 grams of soy protein per day as part of a diet low in saturated fat and cholesterol may reduce risk of heart disease. Now, since that claim was approved in 1999, claims have been approved in several other countries. The most recent country to approve a claim was Canada, which approved its claim in 2015. And here we have a summary of the results of meta-analyses published between 2003 and 2019. So these are meta-analyses of the clinical studies. In the second column, you see the number of studies in each meta-analysis. In the third column, you see the number of participants in these studies. And then the fourth column shows the average reduction in LDL cholesterol. So the reduction ranges from about 3.2% to as high as 6%. So it's a modest effect, but I believe even this modest effect is relevant at the population level, meaning if everyone consumed soy and lowered their cholesterol by 3 or 4%, that would dramatically reduce risk of heart disease. And it's certainly relevant at the patient level because this is one way one can begin to lower cholesterol levels through dietary means. And I say this because each 1% reduction in LDL cholesterol is thought to reduce risk of coronary heart disease by about 2%. You know, at the beginning, I mentioned that soybeans are higher in protein than other legumes, but what really distinguishes protein from a macronutrient perspective is their high fat content. Most beans are almost fat-free, with the exception of chickpeas or garbanzo beans. Beans are typically 3 or 4% on a caloric basis. Soybeans get almost half of their calories from fat. But that fat is very heart healthy. It's low in saturated. It has a moderate amount of monounsaturated, about 22%. The predominant type of fat in soybean oil, not surprisingly, is polyunsaturated fat, both the omega-6 and the omega-3 polyunsaturated fat. And of course, this is the type of fat that lowers blood cholesterol levels when replacing saturated fat in the diet. And because of the ability of soybean oil and the fat in soy foods to lower blood cholesterol levels, the US Food and Drug Administration approved a health claim for soybean oil in 2017. Now, I want to emphasize again that soybean oil and the fat in soy foods contains both the omega-6 polyunsaturated fat, essential fatty acid, linoleic acid, and the omega-3 essential fatty acid, linolenic acid, alpha-linolenic acid. So soybean provides both of the essential fatty acids. And if you're not consuming certain types of fish that are rich in long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, soy foods can make an important contribution to meeting the requirements for the essential omega-3 fatty acid, alpha-linolenic acid. So this is really a helpful way to meet your requirement for this essential fatty acid. And in fact, we see that 100 grams of tofu, which in the United States is approximately 1 serving, provides about 0.7 grams of alpha-linolenic acid. And so that's about half of the requirement for adults and almost all the requirement for younger people. So a couple of servings of soy foods per day can meet your requirement for alpha-linolenic acid. Now I want to talk about soy and breast cancer. This is really why I entered the field in 1989. I was working for the National Cancer Institute in Washington, D.C., and research was published that suggested soy may reduce risk of breast cancer. But before I talk about soy and breast cancer, I want to introduce the topic of isoflavones. Isoflavones are really unique to soybeans and soy foods. And you can see this point illustrated here, where we see that the average isoflavone intake in Japan is about 40 milligrams per day, whereas in the United States and Europe, it's fewer than 3 milligrams. One serving of a traditional soy food provides about 25 milligrams of isoflavones, which indicates that Japanese on average consume about 1.5 servings of soy per day. And you can come up with a good estimate of the isoflavone content of a traditional soy food if you know the amount of protein it provides. So if you take a product like soy milk made from whole soybeans, if that product provides 7 grams of protein per serving, that's going to provide about 25 milligrams of isoflavones because there are 3 to 4 milligrams per gram of protein. Isoflavones have been the subject of a tremendous amount of research. There are about 1,000 scientific papers published on isoflavones each year. And you can see between 1990 and 2000, the number of papers on isoflavones increased about 9-fold. The 2 main isoflavones in soybeans are genistein and daidzein. The isoflavones have a similar chemical structure to 17-beta estradiol or estrogen. So the isoflavones are able to bind to estrogen receptors and to exert estrogen-like effects under certain experimental conditions. And for that reason, they are commonly classified as phytoestrogens or plant estrogens. However, despite their classification as phytoestrogens, they are very different from the hormone estrogen at both the molecular level, how they bind to receptors, and at the clinical level. In fact, sometimes isoflavones will have effects opposite to those of estrogen. And in many tissues that are affected by the hormone estrogen, isoflavones do not have any effect. So isoflavones and estrogen do share some properties in common, but they are also very different. Isoflavones have been proposed to reduce wrinkles, and I'll talk about that, to improve the health of the arteries, to alleviate menopausal hot flashes or hot flushes. This topic has been researched since 1995. They are proposed to improve memory in older individuals and to reduce the risk of breast and prostate cancer. And I'm just going to talk about breast cancer. So again, I became interested in soy because of my belief back in 1989 that soy could reduce the risk of developing breast cancer. I still believe that's the case, but there's a little bit of a twist to the story. So first of all, of course, we know that the rates of breast cancer in soy food consuming countries, excuse me, the rates are quite low relative to Western populations, North America and Europe. But you can also see that the rates are low in Africa and in Central America, and those populations don't consume much soy. So if you're going to make any definitive or meaningful conclusions about the impact of soy on breast cancer, you have to look at other types of information. And the real question is not whether Japanese people or women have a lower rate of breast cancer than, for example, US women. The question is, do women in Japan who consume soy have a lower rate of breast cancer than women in Japan who don't consume soy, or women in Hong Kong, or women in China? So it's not country versus country, it's whether a person who eats soy in that country is less likely to develop breast cancer than their neighbor who doesn't eat soy. So to answer that question, I want to present the results of a recently published meta-analysis, statistical analysis of 20 studies that found soy intake is inversely associated with breast cancer risk. So for premenopausal breast cancer, higher soy intake was associated with a 21% reduction in risk. And for postmenopausal breast cancer, a 12% reduction in risk. Now, both of these findings were statistically significant, but I actually think these findings underestimate the potential role of soy in reducing breast cancer risk. And I say that because, in my opinion, in order for soy to reduce breast cancer risk, it has to be consumed very early in life, during childhood or adolescence. And this was a hypothesis proposed in 1995, so it's been studied for a long time. There are rodent data in support of it, epidemiologic data, and we also have a pretty good understanding of why, when you consume isoflavones via soy foods early in life, breast cancer risk is reduced later on in life. So let's just take a look at the epidemiologic data. 4 studies have evaluated this hypothesis. So these are retrospective studies. They asked women with cancer and without cancer how much soy they consumed when they were younger, during the early period of life. 2 studies from China, 2 from the US. Then you see the number of participants in each study, and then the average decrease in risk associated with high soy intake during this early period of life. So it ranges from 28% reduction to as high as 60% reduction. And I want to focus on this one study from the US. Now, I want to emphasize that it's a very, very small study, so please bear that in mind. But this study utilized a design that the other studies did not. So there were 99 women with breast cancer, 156 controls. The women and the mothers of the women were interviewed to determine their early soy intake. The women were divided into tertiles, 3 groups according to their soy intake, low, medium, and high, but they were also divided into 3 age groups, 5 to 11, 12 to 19, and over the age of 20. And what we see is that consuming higher amounts of soy during childhood was most protective. Now, consuming soy later in life was still protective, but not nearly as protective as childhood soy consumption. So although this hypothesis is still very speculative, I recommend that all girls consume at least one serving of soy per day. It's easy to incorporate soy into the diet. One serving is a relatively small amount. It's a nutritious food. There's no disadvantage to consuming soy, but there may be plenty of benefit for protection against breast cancer. Now let's talk about wrinkles, which is a natural phenomenon due to a variety of degenerative, environmental, genetic, and hormonal influences. The skincare market is huge. It's $145 billion. And skincare accounts for about 40% of the total cosmetic market around the world. And the Asia Pacific region accounts for 43% of the world cosmetic market. Now, interestingly, we know fairly well that topical application of soy extracts provides multiple dermatological and cosmeceutical benefits. These benefits include skin lightening, preventing damage from the sun, improving elasticity, and preventing hair growth. But as a nutritionist, I'm interested in the beauty from within concept, or the beauty from the inside out. I want to know if consuming soy foods is beneficial to the skin. Now, 8 studies have evaluated the effects of soy on skin health. 5 looked at the effect on wrinkles. 1 looked at collagen, which is the protein in the skin that provides structure. The protein decreases with age, which causes wrinkles. 1 looked at a composite score for the skin, and the other one looked at hydration. All of these studies showed beneficial effects. However, all of these studies had design limitations. They could have been a small sample size, maybe not an appropriate control. Perhaps the isoflavones were combined with other bioactives. So while these data are encouraging, they don't allow any definitive conclusions from being made. Nevertheless, I want to focus on this one study from Japan by Nagino, because it was a very interesting design. And this study found that daily intake of fermented soy milk, as well as traditional soy milk, unfermented soy milk, improves skin condition via increased levels of isoflavone absorption. So this was an 8-week study involving 57 postmenopausal women. The women consumed 200 milliliters per day of either fermented or unfermented soy milk that provided about 40 milligrams of isoflavones. The women filled out a facial skin questionnaire at the beginning and at the end of the study. And then they also underwent a biopsy of the skin for a more objective determination of the effects. Well, here we see something that's completely expected, which is that as the women, during the time the women were consuming the soy milk, isoflavone levels in the urine increased about 3-fold. When they stopped consuming the isoflavones, the levels went down to their baseline values. Here we have the results of the facial skin questionnaire, and it's a very busy slide. So I'll just summarize it by saying, in each case, the women judged that their skin had improved during the 8 weeks they were consuming soy milk. When they stopped consuming soy milk, their skin condition reverted back to the baseline condition. But this is a subjective determination of the effects. What we really want to focus on is the biopsy that was taken of the women. And this was a composite score looking at many factors, many skin conditions. The higher the score, the better. So at the beginning of the study, both groups had a score of about 4. After consuming soy milk for 8 weeks, the score just about doubled, and those findings were statistically significant. So I'm very encouraged by the existing data, and so is the United Soybean Board and the Soy Nutrition Institute Global. because very recently, these organizations funded a 2-year trial at a cost of $400,000. This study is comparing the effects of soy protein, 25 grams per day, with casein. It's a 6-month study. The outcomes to be determined are wrinkle depth, collagen, which again is the protein in the skin, and pigmentation. And I'm very optimistic that this study will produce robust results. And if it does, I think the results of this study combined with the existing data will allow us to make some more definitive conclusions about the impact of soy on skin. Now I want to finish up by looking at some myths and misunderstandings about soy and then soy allergy. There's a lot of misinformation about diet in general online, but there's an enormous amount in particular about soy foods. So let's first take a look at this concern that soy may adversely affect the prognosis of breast cancer patients. So we already looked at the role that soy may have in breast cancer prevention. Now we're looking at the effect it has on women with breast cancer. And this is a very common question that clinicians are asking. Does high dietary soy intake affect the woman's risk of primary or recurrent breast cancer? Now, the concern is based on the fact that estrogen actually stimulates the growth of certain types of breast tumors, those referred to as estrogen receptor positive breast tumors. But something you may not recognize is that it's not at all clear that the hormone estrogen, when you take it orally, actually increases breast cancer risk. In fact, the largest trial ever conducted, the Women's Health Initiative clinical trial, found that the use of conjugated equine estrogens, these are different types of estrogen, compared with placebo, ended up reducing the development of breast cancer and breast cancer mortality. So estrogen therapy may not actually increase breast cancer risk as was once thought. So I wanted to answer the question about soy. I want to turn to a paper that was published just a few months ago. There is little evidence that isoflavone treatment modulates risk factors of breast cancer in pre- and postmenopausal women. So this meta-analysis and systematic review involved 18 clinical trials. The doses used in the trial range from 36 milligrams per day to 235. Now remember, 40 milligrams is the average intake in Japan. So 235 milligrams is a huge amount of isoflavones. That's about 10 servings of soy. The duration of the studies went from 1 to 36 months. And the investigators looked at all these markers or indicators of breast cancer risk: breast tissue density, breast cell proliferation, no adverse effects whatsoever. And again, in many cases, these studies involve not just healthy women, but also women with breast cancer. And I want to focus on breast cell proliferation. So isoflavones did not have any effect on breast cell proliferation. The faster cells replicate, the less time they have to repair DNA damage, so the more likely they are to be transformed into a cancer cell. So you don't want cells to replicate quickly. Isoflavones had no effect on breast cell proliferation. In contrast, combined hormone therapy, estrogen plus progestin, increases breast cell proliferation 4 to 10-fold within just 12 weeks. And we know that combined hormone therapy increases breast cancer risk. I mentioned before that estrogen may not increase breast cancer risk, but here we're talking about estrogen plus progestin or progesterone, and it's progesterone that is the problem. So the American Institute for Cancer Research, the American Cancer Society, the Canadian Cancer Society, and the World Cancer Research Fund have all concluded that soy is safe for breast cancer patients. The European Food Safety Authority and the German Research Foundation concluded isoflavones do not adversely affect breast tissue. And in fact, there's evidence to suggest that not only is soy safe, but soy may benefit women with breast cancer. I say that on the basis of this meta-analysis that involved 5 studies, 3 from China, 2 from the US, 11,000 women with breast cancer. The women were followed from between 4 and 7 years. During that time, there were almost 1,000 breast cancer deaths, and 1,500 women had a recurrence of their disease. The meta-analysis found consuming soy after a diagnosis of breast cancer reduces risk of recurrence by 16% and death from breast cancer by 26%. And both findings were statistically significant. So in many respects, we've gone from a situation in the 1990s where animal research suggested that soy could be harmful for breast cancer patients to research today in humans suggesting soy is beneficial. The soy feminized men. Now, this is a topic that I am personally and professionally interested in because I consume soy on a daily basis. So the question is, does soy lower testosterone levels or does it raise estrogen levels in men? And you have to look at estrogen in addition to testosterone because older men actually make more estrogen than older women. And the answer to this question is that soy foods do not affect testosterone or estrogen levels. Here we have the results of a meta-analysis of 41 clinical trials involving almost 2,000 men, no effect on total testosterone, no effect on free testosterone, which is the biologically active form, no effect on estrogen levels. What about gynecomastia? This refers to enlargement of breast tissue in men. Well, 2 studies have looked at the effects of soy and gynecomastia. Neither one showed an effect. And I'll just present the results of the most important study because this is a very long study, 3 years, a very large study, 300 men, and a very large dose of isoflavones, 100 milligrams per day, about 4 servings of soy. No effects on breast tenderness, no effects on swelling or enlargement, no evidence of gynecomastia. What about sperm and semen? Well, 3 clinical studies have looked at these outcomes. None of these studies have found any adverse effects on sperm or semen parameters. And one of these studies used the equivalent of about 20 servings of soy. Now, it's interesting, this myth that soy feminizes men was actually started to a large extent by an article in a popular men's magazine in the United States in 2009. But there may be a hidden dark side to consuming soy, one that has the power to undermine everything it means to be male. Very scary stuff. Well, in 2015, this same magazine said soy contains phytoestrogens, plant-based hormones that may in excess lead to dips in testosterone. However, up to 4 servings a day shouldn't hurt. Well, no one should be consuming more than 4 servings per day. And even consuming more than 4 still does not cause a lowering of testosterone levels. That was in 2015. And then they actually apologized for their initial perspective on soy. In 2019, in an article, Is Tofu the New King of Protein? But what about sperm count in man boobs? The gynecomastia, several news outlets, including this one, our mistake, our bad, may have overblown those findings. They not just overblew them, they completely misinterpreted the data. What about soy and thyroid function? This is an area that's been investigated for almost 100 years. I'll just turn to a meta-analysis published in 2019 involving 18 clinical trials. No statistically significant effects on thyroxine or triiodothyronine, which are the main 2 thyroid hormones, T4 and T3. What about gout? Many health professionals in Asia think that soy increases risk of gout. Gout is a form of arthritis. It used to be called the disease of kings because it was thought that only rich people could afford a diet that could cause gout. But of course, there are 41 million people around the world with gout, and they are certainly not all kings. So anybody can develop gout. I mentioned that many health professionals in Asia think that soy increases risk of gout. Here we have a survey in Singapore, Indonesia, and Thailand showing that 48% of the health professionals actually thought that soy could increase risk of gout. In contrast to that mistaken belief, we see that the British Society for Rheumatology, in their guidelines for the management of gout, recommends losing weight if overweight, a diet low in fat and add in sugars, but they also recommend increasing the consumption of vegetables, high fiber foods, low fat dairy products, and soybeans. And here we have a meta-analysis published in 2018 that shows that consuming soy foods was associated with a 15% reduction in the risk of developing gout. And then finally, soy has also been claimed to be an endocrine disruptor, excuse me, which is an endogenous substance or mixture that alters the functions of the endocrine system and consequently causes adverse health effects. Well, there was a recently published paper. I was one of 10 authors. We looked at all of the effects of soy related to endocrine disruption. All these individuals, you can see from all over the world, are now internationally recognized experts in the soy field. We looked at feminization, fertility, menstrual cycle, breast cancer, endometrial cancer, puberty onset in children, hormones. We looked at everything, and we concluded the results of the observational clinical studies covering a broad range of health outcomes likely to be affected by endocrine active substances indicate that neither soy foods nor isoflavones warrant classification as endocrine disruptors. I'll also mention that in 2017, the US Food and Drug Administration conducted a comprehensive analysis of the scientific literature, and they concluded that the use of soy protein at the levels necessary to justify a health claim has been demonstrated to our satisfaction to be safe. Those levels are 25 grams per day. The FDA rejected all of the safety concerns about soy. And now let's just finish up with food allergies. Over 200 foods have been shown to cause allergic reactions, but in the United States and several other countries, regulatory bodies have established the list of major allergens. In the US, there are 8 major allergens and soy is one. These 8 major allergens are responsible for 90% of the food allergic reactions among Americans. But the prevalence of allergy for the 8 foods differs markedly. And in fact, according to this 2020 review paper, among the 8 foods, soy has the lowest prevalence. On average, the surveys indicate about 3 adults out of every 1,000 are allergic to soy. So it does occur, but it's relatively infrequent. 70% of children who are allergic to soy outgrow their soy allergy by age 10. And highly refined soybean oil is not allergenic. So even if you are sensitive to soy protein, you can consume soybean oil. And then I just want to mention that the environmental impact of soy, because this is increasingly becoming a factor in the food purchasing decisions of consumers, soy protein is extremely efficiently produced. And I can show you lots of data to support that statement. So the final point is that the science supports both the safety and the benefits of soy, and it also has a very low global warming potential. So there's all sorts of reasons to consume soy. And I want to thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much. So it's very interesting and informative talks. I already see people say, could we share the information? Well, we have made the video, so I guess you will have a chance to visit or share with friends. So before we move on to the Q&A sessions, may I invite everybody to take the pictures together. So please turn on your camera so that we can capture your face. Wow, I see a lot of familiar face. So I see McHugh there. Oh, Dr. Chai. So hi. Wow. So yeah, many different people here. So Joanna, can you help us to take pictures? I think we have to take several of them. So please turn on your camera.
Okay, so we'll take the first one. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Smile. Okay, we'll take another one. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Smile. One more. 1, 2, 3. Smile. Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I think this is the time for everyone to ask questions directly. So yes, just do it. All right. So who want to say something? Just start. Unmute yourself and talk. Or you can type into the chat box.
Well, maybe I'll be the first one to go then. Firstly, thank you very much, Mike, for a very informative talk. Today I joined a little bit late, so I might have missed some of the critical points you made. I was on a flight from South Africa to the US, so a bit jet lagged. I just wanted to find out though, with regards to the demonstration of no effects of soy on, well, let's say the human reproductive system and no effects on the lowering of testosterone levels. You're telling us that there are no effects, but I was wondering if it's actually, the mechanisms behind why there are no effects, seeing that some of these secondary metabolites seem to have hormone action in females, beneficial, of course. Is it because they are extracted in males and so therefore they don't alter male hormone levels, or is the mechanism known of how or what happens to the secondary metabolites? Are they broken down? Are they extracted and therefore do not really have an effect?
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. And I'll answer that in two ways. First of all, of course, isoflavones and estrogen are different and they bind to receptors differently in that there are at least two estrogen receptors. There's two major receptors, estrogen receptor alpha and estrogen receptor beta. And estrogen binds with equal affinity to both of those receptors, whereas isoflavones prefer binding and activating estrogen receptor beta. And estrogen receptor beta has many times effects opposite to those of estrogen receptor alpha. So the effects of isoflavones will be determined to a large extent by the relative proportion of each of those two receptors in any given tissue. So there's a reason why they differ from estrogen. But your other question is, well, if they alleviate hot flashes, which I believe that they do, and I didn't discuss that, but there's evidence to show that they do. And it's thought that they alleviate hot flashes through an estrogen-like mechanism. Then if they're exerting an estrogen-like effect under that case, why aren't they lowering testosterone levels in men, for example? And all I can say is that I always base my conclusions on the clinical trial data, because we don't fully understand how isoflavones work. You mentioned metabolites, but once isoflavones get to a tissue, they are metabolized, in that tissue, and there may be metabolites of the parent isoflavones that act in ways that we are not fully understanding. So I think the only thing one can do is to actually look at the clinical trial data, because in the end, that's what matters. It's nice to have a mechanistic understanding of how something works, but what we really care about is the clinical effect. And, as I presented, there are studies looking at testosterone levels, involving almost 2,000 men, and there's just no effect on testosterone. So I will have to admit, I don't fully understand, exactly why isoflavones may have effects in one tissue but not another. I mean, so far the evidence that isoflavones affect bone health is not very impressive, and yet estrogen favorably affects bone health. So again, in the end, you just have to look at the clinical trial data, and it's very, very, very clear.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, so Tico is from South Africa, so they're very interested in developing soy food. Okay, so second questions, please.
Mark, this is Joanna. With your many of soya study, and I realized recently globally maybe only like 10 to 15% of the soya produced are consumed as food by human beings. We know in Africa, there is a fastest population growth. They have a food security in there badly. So is there any special program that that are promoting the soy food? Because I think they, in that area, they consume very little soya. So is anything being done to improve that?
So I had some problems hearing because you froze during your question a little bit, but I think I understand your question, and you make a really good point. Most of the soybeans are used for animal feed, and that's certainly the case in the United States. And we grow billions, literally 2 billion bushels of soybeans are produced each year. And soybean production in South America has been linked with deforestation, but those soybeans are actually used for animal feed, not for human consumption. So I actually have in preparation a paper in which I make the argument that soybeans are the perfect food for meeting the challenge of feeding a global population of 10 billion people by the year 2050. So, and also I think that the increasing emphasis on the impact of our diet on the environment will put more emphasis on consuming plant foods. And there is no more efficient way to produce protein than producing soybeans. And that's well established. So I do think in the coming years, soy is going to become a bigger part of the world food supply. On the other hand, estimates are like for China, that meat intake is expected to double over the next 30 years. As the socioeconomic status of a population increases, their intake of animal products tend to increase. And that's one reason, and this is just a personal opinion, that I like the soy burgers. Now, one very famous one in the US is called the Impossible Burger, and it's starting to make its way around the world. It's a great product. It provides 19 grams of protein per patty. and it's environmentally, it's advantageous. And in my opinion, it will be hard for non-Asians to give up meat and or reduce their meat intake and to consume more tofu. I mean, I eat tofu. Everybody I know eats tofu, and I've been eating tofu since 1972. So it's a long time. But it's not a traditional food in most countries around the world. They're used to meat, and I have a paper that I just that was just submitted that talks about the fact that vegetarians will be willing to eat tofu, but meat eaters actually want something that replicates the taste of meat. So I think that if soy plays a bigger role in the world food supply, it's going to do it in the form of these meat substitutes and also the plant milks. And you know that the plant milks have really eaten into dairy consumption is decreasing and plant milk consumption is increasing. So I'm optimistic, but people have a very difficult time changing their diet, unfortunately. And people like the taste of meat, and in some places it's still a status symbol. So I think it's gradually soybeans will play a bigger role.
Hi, Mark, maybe I ask a technical question. So I heard many times that soybeans are deficient in sulfide-containing amino acids, which is some essential amino acids such as methionine. So is fortification needed for like human consumption if we just eat soybean as the protein source?
Yeah, so thank you. So the limiting amino acids, which for those of you may not know, are the amino acids in the shortest supply relative to requirements, are the sulfur-containing amino acids, methionine and cysteine. And that's true for beans in general. Now, grains are high in sulfur-containing amino acids, but they're low in lysine, and beans are high in lysine. That's why the combination of grains and beans tends to make a very high quality protein. And if you look at the cuisines around the world, you see people combining grains and beans, whether it's rice and tofu or tortillas and black beans in South America. But in the case of soy, as you saw in one slide that presented the data for the protein digestibility corrected amino acid score, the method for evaluating protein quality, soy protein receives a score of 1.0, meaning that it has enough of the sulfur amino acids to meet our body's requirements. But those are the limiting amino acids in beans. So you don't need to supplement them, but they are the ones in shortest supply.
Thank you. So
now for infants, by the way, for infants, they do typically add methionine to soy infant formula.
Okay, so other questions from the audience?
May I have a question?
Amy.
Yes. Thank you very much for the talk. I'm from a plant lab. So from the perspective of plant growth, it seems that the primary purpose of storing nutrients in seeds is for the growth of the next generation. But then compared to other legumes, why are soybeans so rich in protein and oil? Is it something more related to the domestication and human selection of soybean?
I have to admit that question is far outside my area of expertise. There are over 10,000 varieties of soybeans, and through identifying beans that have a slightly higher protein content, those beans tend to be the ones that are used by farmers growing soybeans. But you also have to take into consideration the yield, because that's, you want to grow as many soybeans per acre as possible. And there are efforts underway to genetically manipulate the bean to produce a slightly higher protein content. But it's actually the fat in soybeans that makes soybeans so unique. And that's why soybean oil is actually the leading vegetable oil in the world and in the US. In the US, it provides over 7% of our calories, which is just an amazing amount for one food to provide that many calories. So yeah, that's more of a agricultural question, so I apologize. I just don't have the background for that.
Yeah, that's for the information. Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please, John.
Oh, hi. Well, thanks once again. My question is really on egg whites. Obviously, egg features very, very largely in a lot of our diet. I just wonder, we have hard-boiled egg, which is a solid form of egg white, and on the other extreme, we have liquid egg white. I mean, what exactly, when we refer to digestibility, are there any is there a difference between, say, on one hand, hard-boiled egg, which is the solid form, and a liquid form, egg white?
Again, my expertise is on soy, but I will just say, so I only tend to, I don't like to go beyond my area of expertise, but all I can say is the digestibility of egg protein is extremely high. I mean, the digestibility of animal proteins is higher than the digestibility of plant proteins. So for that reason, in my opinion, and it's not universally shared by any means, I think that people consuming a completely plant-based diet need to consume more protein than someone consuming a diet with both plant and animal protein. So I recommend, for example, vegans, who only consume plant protein, I recommend that vegans consume 10 to 20% more protein than a person who is an omnivore, because some of the digestibility of some beans can be 75%, whereas digestibility of animal products is really very close to 100%. So I don't know if there's an effect of processing or the different form of eggs, but I'm sure it's very, very high.
So I have a question about soy then. So soy has carbohydrate, and yes, they have very, very low level of starch. So for the carbohydrate in soybean seeds, is it can they provide energy for human as just similar to the starch, or they have a different metabolism?
Half of the carbohydrate in soy is actually comprised of the oligosaccharides, raffinose, stachyose, that aren't digested by or are very poorly digested by our intestinal enzymes. So they are thought of being prebiotics. They can stimulate the growth of, friendly bacteria. And in fact, back in 1990, Japanese researchers actually proposed using the soybean oligosaccharides as a replacement for sugar, because you could get the sweetness from the oligosaccharides and also stimulate your bacteria. But when you actually look at many of the soy foods, like tofu, for example, it's going to have, very, very low amounts of carbohydrate. But the carbohydrate, the fiber has been studied in the same way that other bean fibers have been studied. So I would say, yeah, it's similar to the carbohydrate in other beans, but it's just very low amounts in soybeans, as you indicated, because they're so high in protein and so high in fat, they have to be low in something, and that's carbohydrate.
But will there be a difference between human consumption and animals such as cow or sheep? They can retain the carbohydrate for a longer time? I mean, I just wonder, because those are energy that human cannot consume perfectly, because there's a different kind of carbohydrate. But how about the animals, ruminant animals? Will they have a better efficiency?
Yeah, I don't know much about cows, so
okay.
I'm sorry.
All right, okay, thank you. Yes, please unmute yourself and ask questions.
I have a question. Yeah, I wonder if there's any research on the benefits of bean sprout, soybean sprouts, because sprouts are eaten particularly by Asians, East Asians, but the Japanese, the Chinese, the Koreans, and this Asian population believes that they are very nutritious. So I don't know whether this particular way of eating, consuming soybeans have been studied scientifically. And in traditional East Asian materia medica, bean sprouts were particularly considered as a very effective medicine.
Yeah, I think how much of the bean sprouts that are consumed are actually come from soy versus other types of beans?
Oh, I don't have the figures, but you can, the Chinese, we eat sprouts from green beans as well, but also a lot from soybeans, yellow beans, black beans.
If you could email me, I want to look this up because I do have several papers on soybean sprouts and the impact of germination on isoflavone content. Generally, I think of sprouting as a beneficial process, but I don't think they've been studied clinically. And in observational studies, they may be included among many soy foods, but I don't, if they're looking at soybean intake in China, soybean sprouts would be one of the foods that they would look at. But I don't have any specific data in which soybean sprouts were compared clinically to another type of soy food. But I do have several papers on the differences in their micronutrient and macronutrient composition, isoflavone composition. So if you want to email me, I want to look at that because that's something I would like to write about.
Excuse you, what would you like me to email you? What kind of information?
Just as a reminder, so I can send you the information.
Okay, sure. So I believe that Professor Lam will give me your email.
Yes, I have. Just I have Mark's email. So anyone who would like to have it, I can share.
Because I write a blog post every 2 weeks, and I would like to do it on that topic because that's something that I find very interesting. It's also, I do worry about the protease inhibitor content and how much heat is applied to the beans. And, normally germination is considered to decrease the anti-nutrient content. So there may be some advantages, like there may be some advantages to fermenting soy products. That's another topic of interest.
So Mark, I think that the sprouts is quite popular nowadays because they can grow very fast. They can even grow in chambers. So the homemade grow chambers can grow the sprouts very fast, and they can harvest multiple times because when you put enough seeds there, so after you harvest the first layer, the second layer come out. So the microgreen has become quite popular today.
But if you look, and this is something I don't know, and maybe you could help me, if you look at the amount of sprouts that someone would use in a meal, how much protein do you think is provided by those sprouts?
Yeah, you mean by just eating the sprouts, right?
Yeah, because I suspect it's not very much.
Yeah, so I think people just treat it as vegetables. So they cook it as vegetables rather than cook it. Yeah.
Would they use the sprout as a separate dish, or would it be on something?
With meat. Yeah.
Well, let me look into that because I'm concerned that the amount of sprouts actually being consumed, because the water content is so high that there's actually the protein provided in isoflavones may be actually low that someone's consuming, but I will look into that.
Okay, thank you.
I think the Chinese doctors consider sprouts not as nutritious as a protein-rich vegetable, but as something which is good for your hormones.
Yeah, I tend to go by the clinical data, so.
Yeah, I know.
Okay, all right. So, yes. So, other questions from the audience?
Well, to add a comment on this sprout, I recall before there were some commercial about promoting the sprouting soybean. That means when soybeans are sprouting, the nutrients are changing. So there's some beneficial effect for those sprouting soybean, but not on the sprout itself. So that's what I remember.
It starts with rice. So sprouting, germinating rice has produced additional nutrients compared to rice itself. So, but well, I saw McGill, you raised your hand, right? McGill from Panama. You want to ask a question?
Yeah. Well, in Panama, we have a very nice morning today. Being a Chinese, I started consuming soy products since I was a kid. And I've been always been asked by Westerners if by drinking tea they can reduce their weight. And I always wonder if the people in the Western countries are overweight is because of a diet because of they didn't start consuming soy products since their childhood. Because I always come up with the answer that I don't think it's the effect of drink tea or not drinking tea, but since we started absorbing vegetable fats instead of animal fats since we were a child, is it related between the fat that we have since we were a child?
Yeah, I would like to think that eating tofu prevents obesity later in life, but I don't think that's the case. I think that you know, populations around the world are increasing in body mass index and body size, and I think that there are many factors related to the obesity epidemic. I mean, in the United States and many other countries, now something like 30% of the children are actually obese, which is just terrible, of course, because they're going to have to deal with the consequences of obesity, you know, for 70 years. Whereas if you become obese when you're older, it's less detrimental to your health. Nobody has figured out why people are becoming more obese. There are many hypotheses about the effect of foods on glucose levels and the insulin response. There's foods that are considered to be hyperpalatable. Often these ultra-processed foods are considered to be hyperpalatable so that they don't cause you to stop eating like other foods might. It's such a complicated topic, and I'm certainly not an obesity expert, but I don't see anything in soy directly that would help to control obesity, other than the fact that there is one theory that a higher protein diet actually may cause a spontaneous reduction in caloric intake. And because soy foods are higher in protein, they may be advantageous for that reason. But this is an incredibly complex issue that I'm positive is not going to have any one simple answer. And unfortunately, also, I fear that while we were talking before about the potential for soy to actually become a more important food around the world, you know, what you see in Japan, for example, it's harder for it, you know, in China, as you know, it's a very heterogeneous population with respect to their diet. So there's, and I don't mean to be telling you something you already know, but if you look at Shanghai, it's a very high soy food consuming region. It's actually, the studies show it's the highest soy food consuming region in the world. But there are some areas in China where almost no soy is consumed. I mean, just a few grams of protein per day. So in Japan, it's more homogeneous. So you have a better sense of what's happening nationally. And I just looked at some figures where over the past 20 years, meat intake doubled and soy intake decreased by 50%. So unfortunately, you have these trends where more people are consuming animal-based diets because their socioeconomic status has increased. So in terms of soy, I don't think any one food has any specific role in preventing obesity. It's just a complex topic, but I do think that some foods that are more ultra processed, like snack foods, where it's very easy to consume, 400 calories without even thinking about it. And so even if you look at something like apple juice or an apple, I mean, we drink apple juice in this country, and you could only eat one apple, and I don't know, maybe that's 50 or 60, 70 calories at the most, but you could drink 200 calories of apple juice. So I do think that the more foods are in their refined state, it becomes easier to overconsume those foods.
I appreciate your answer.
Eden, you raise your hand?
Yes.
Yeah, please ask your question.
Hi, Mark. I have a follow-up question. So it's also about the soybean oil. I heard that the soybean oil may be associated with diabetes. So have you heard about that, and what is your opinion?
Yeah, so thank you. So first of all, I can send you a paper I just wrote on soybean oil. There's two issues. One is that there had been a concern that omega-6 fatty acids, mainly linoleic acid, is pro-inflammatory, because it was thought that omega-6 fatty acids are converted in your body to arachidonic acid, which are then converted in your body to oxylipins and eicosanoids, which promote inflammation. So there's been a long-standing concern that vegetable oils may be pro-inflammatory. But we know now that that's not the case. For example, 7 studies have looked at the effects of soybean oil on inflammation, 7 clinical studies. None of them have shown any adverse effects. And we also know that the linoleic acid in food is actually not converted into arachidonic acid in your tissues. In respect to diabetes, there's quite a bit of research suggesting that polyunsaturated fat, in comparison to saturated fat, actually increases insulin sensitivity. So the data go in the opposite direction of from what you're suggested or asked, that soybean oil, if anything, soybean oil would have a role in decreasing risk of developing diabetes because it increases insulin sensitivity. Having said that, most diabetes, which is type 2 diabetes, really occurs in people who are overweight. So from a public health perspective, the most important thing that we can do to reduce the risk of developing diabetes is to prevent obesity, which is not easy, but that's what we must do.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Any more questions from the audience? If not, I'll take the opportunity to ask the last question. So FAO and also Bill Gates advocated for fermented food as a additional nutrients for developing country. So soybean has been used traditionally to make a lot of fermented foods. How would you see the potential of using this kind of fermented soybean products in developing countries to improve the nutrients?
Yeah, so there's a lot of discussion about fermented versus unfermented soy foods. Now, most soy consumed in the world is unfermented, okay? Because in China, because obviously with China population, there the foods are, even though we talked about stinky tofu in Taiwan, but of course, most soy consumed is in the form of soy milk and tofu, unfermented food. I do think that fermented soy foods may have some advantages. You know, the isoflavones are, when you ferment a food, they are converted from the glycoside to the aglycone form. There are some antioxidants that are formed as a result of fermentation. It's possible the fermented foods will have a probiotic effect. So there, you know, the anti-nutrient content is reduced somewhat. So there's some theoretical basis for thinking fermented foods have advantages, but this has not been demonstrated clinically. So to my knowledge, there hasn't been one study that has actually compared the effects of something like tofu with, you know, tempeh or miso or any other kind of fermented food. So I think it's very speculative. I also think that some of the fermented foods have a stronger taste than the unfermented foods. And that may be a problem in terms of worldwide adoption. Now, I've been to Indonesia several times, which is the birthplace of tempeh, and that's one of my favorite soy foods. And I eat a lot of miso. So I do eat fermented soy foods, but I think the key is to try to consume at least, I would like everybody to consume 2 servings of soy per day, because 2 servings is the amount that in the clinical studies is associated with benefit. So I would like everybody to consume 2 servings per day. And if you're getting from those 2 servings 15 or 17 grams of protein, that still means that soy is only providing maybe a 1/4 or a 1/5 of your total protein intake. So it's not placing too much emphasis on one food. So 2 servings is a good amount, to a good goal. But the reality is if you are dealing with the population like Europe, where they consume no soy, you know, going from no soy to 2 servings is a lot. So I always say 2 servings is ideal, but 1 serving is better than none.
Okay. All right. So any last minute questions for Mark?
And anyone is welcome to email me if you have any, you know, questions that you would ask later on.
Okay. So before we end, so I borrow a few minutes. So first of all, of course, we thank Mark for the wonderful talk, and we'll make videos so that people can revisit and also share with friends. So now I did do some advertisement for my next talk. So our next talk on September 2nd with the topic pollution in agricultural fields. What are we actually eating, by Professor Martin Cui of this university. Okay, so if you are interested in pollution, you want to see how we can prevent or avoid pollution, please join this talk by Martin. So you can scan the QR code, and we'll also mail this information to all the participants in today's talk. Okay, so with that, I think we have to have a happy evening in Hong Kong and a very fruitful morning for Mark in the US. And I think I have to thank Mark and also the friends from different places of the world. I think it's a good opportunity for us to come together, learn something new, and maybe in the future we can do something together to help the food security and the environment by doing a good agricultural practice. Okay, so thanks again, and okay.
Thank you, Mark.
Good night, forever.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.